This playlist will collect together and organize the individual component modules, which together will comprise our first lecture on philosophical theories of mental representation. In this lecture, I want to introduce some background material that I don't include in the readings. For the arc of this lecture, we'll begin by discussing some of the quote-unquote official or framing assumptions around the attempt to formulate a philosophical theory of mental representation. The things that philosophers explicitly say about the nature of the project of formulating a theory of mental representation. Then I'm going to suggest there are a whole bunch of unofficial framing assumptions, things that philosophers adhere to even if they don't explicitly state them as criterion. Then we'll look at the first of three theories that we're going to cover in these lectures. This first theory is also a theory that isn't covered in the reading per se, and it's usually given short shrift, but it's not inconsequential. It's the only version of the intrinsic property approach that I know of. It's the similarity theory, the idea that a state represents something in the world, an object, a property, an event, or a relationship, in virtue of the fact that the state and the thing that that state is representing are similar. That is, they share certain properties. We'll end this lecture by just talking about introducing the other class of theories, the class that has the greatest number of advocates. And that is the class of theories that understand representation in terms of some sort of use that that state has within the theory or for the purposes of cognition. Turning our attention then to those official framing assumptions, Jerry Fodor states them fairly concisely in a quote from Psychosemantics, his 1987 book. The viability of the causal theory depends on its being able to specify in naturalistic vocabulary, hence in non-semantic and non-intentional vocabulary, circumstances such that A, in those circumstances, horse tokens co-vary with horses, i.e. instantiations of horses would cause the horse token to be tokened in my belief box, i.e. would cause me to believe here's a horse, were the circumstances to obtain, and B, horse tokens expresses the property horse in my idiolect of mental ease in virtue of the truth of A. Let's unpack this quotation then and see if we can't get a formulation of a set of official assumptions that govern this project. To start, we should articulate the goal of the project. The goal of this project is to formulate a theory of mental representation that is reductive and consistent with monistic physicalism, so that it provides us with a way of understanding how physical things can be about other things. Fodor's quotation really introduces three official assumptions about how that project should be carried out. To start, it's a definitional theory. The theory must offer individually necessary and jointly sufficient conditions for a mental state to represent an object or a property, an event, or a relationship. Second, it has to be naturalistically specified. The theory has to specify those individually necessary and jointly sufficient conditions in a manner that proves consistent with monistic physicalism. And third, it also has to specify those conditions in a non-semantic, non-intentional manner. That is, the theory must not appeal to semantic or intentional terms or notions either explicitly or implicitly, since its goal is semantic reduction. Now, in addition to these three official assumptions, I think there are a number of unofficial assumptions that also serve to constrain this project. Call them UA as a group. The first of the UA assumptions is that content must be univocal. A representational state can have only one content. The second assumption is that content must be specified in a manner that is task independent. Content remains fixed for a given mental state across all contexts and through all individual kinds of tasks. Third, The theory must act so that content is determinate. That is, the univocal, task-independent contents get fixed by the theory for all instances. So the theory acts as an effective decision procedure. It will discriminate between instances and non-instances of the represented object, property, event, or relationship. The representation relation, then, will always tell you whether or not a state represents something or doesn't, and what it represents. Not kind of, not sort of, but definitely. And finally, many participants in the debate, though certainly not all, hold that content must also be consciously accessible. The cognizer must have at least an in-principle access to the contents of their thoughts. There cannot be assignments of content that are not accessible, at least in principle, to conscious awareness. Now, these four assumptions might seem a little contentious. They're not reflected necessarily in an obvious way in Fodor's quotation, so I'll give you some quotations from the literature to illustrate how I think they come into play. Our first quotation comes from Stephen Schiffer's Remnants of Meaning. It's rather long, but I think it's quite to the point. On page 80, Schiffer tells us, "I cannot resist a methodological reflection. It may happen that one is committed to delivering a paper, and that one discovers, at the last minute and to one's horror, that one's theory has an absurd consequence. A consequence so absurd that if it is pointed out by a critic, it will, without further ado, be taken as a refutation of one's position. Now, the best thing to do in this deplorable situation is to point out the disastrous consequence oneself before anyone can notice it, and to embrace it. I cannot, however, claim to have discovered this methodological gem, for I suspect its employment in Jerry Fodor's cheerful acknowledgement that his theory entails that under optimal conditions, everyone is omniscient and infallible." Schiffer's quote here refers to the effective decision procedure, the determinateness that's built into Jerry Fodor's gnomic covariation theory of mental content. Our next quote comes from Lawrence Bonjour and speaks to the idea that content should be at least in principle consciously accessible. Bonjour tells us, "I shall argue that any such view is clearly mistaken. The reason being, it is unable to do justice to the fundamental fact that the contents of our thoughts is, to some significant degree at least, accessible to us. That is, we are able to tell, quote unquote, from the inside what we are thinking. Thus, if I think that there is a dead crab on the beach, I know that I'm thinking about a certain distinctive sort of marine animal, and not, for example, a furry mammal or a red fruit or a motor vehicle." Finally, Fred Dretske. In Knowledge in the Flow of Information, Dretske tells us, "Knowing is hard, but believing is no piece of cake either. In fact, or so I wish to argue, believing something requires precisely the same skills involved in knowing. Anyone who believes something thereby exhibits the cognitive resources for knowing. There is, as we shall see, a gap between belief and knowledge, but it is not one that provides any sort of comfort to the philosophical skeptic. If I may, for dramatic effect, overstate my case somewhat, if you can't know it, you can't believe it either." Thus, when we put those pieces together, we get two sets of conditions, the official conditions and the unofficial augmented conditions. Officially, a theory of mental representation must provide a set of individually necessary and jointly sufficient conditions for assigning content, expressed in naturalistic terminology, free of any semantic or intentional terms. Unofficially, however, a given mental representation possesses only one content, employed across all contexts and cognitive tasks. The content conditions act such that the system possesses an almost infallible and omniscient mechanism for tokening the representation in the presence of the represented object, property, event, or relation. Additionally, for many theorists, the content of the representation must be at least, in principle, accessible consciously.